Thank you for meeting with me. My client's eager to reach a reasonable compromise.
That's what we're here for. At least if you have a good reason for the government to compromise. My job description allows me to settle an issue in a deficiency notice in light of the hazards of litigation, which means if we may lose on the law or the facts. An acceptable compromise, though, has to be of a value between 20% and 80% of the tax that would be due under the deficiency notice. So in your case, I would not be able to agree with everything that you may want.
A compromise in that range could still be acceptable to my client.
Well, let's see. The examining agent assessed a deficiency of $750,000 for 2011 against ACE, which is the amount of the electric vehicle credit it took in 2009 because it disposed of the vehicles in 2011. Shouldn't ACE have to give up the benefit of that credit? That's what this deficiency notice is all about.
I know you're thinking in terms of the tax benefit rule. We all agree with the examining agent that usually when a taxpayer takes a credit in one year and an inconsistent event occurs in a later year, the taxpayer has to back out the credit that year. And that means adding the amount of the credit back to the taxes due for the inconsistent year. In the usual sense, in other words, the $750,000 credit taken in 2009, like the one at issue here, will be canceled out by adding $750,000 to the taxpayer's 2011 tax. We agree to all that. But this isn't the usual situation. Credit has its own special rules.
I don't know, it seems like the Section 30 regs just state the tax benefit rule in a way that reflects how the credit works.
Well, no, there are some special differences. The regs say that some events that occur within 3 years are recapture events. They say, well, let me get them together for me. Okay. If a recapture event occurs with respect to a taxpayer's qualified vehicle, the taxpayer must add the recapture amount to the amount of tax due in the taxable year in which the recapture event occurs. But then it goes on to limit the recapture events to events that happen within 3 years from when the vehicle is put into service. That's in section 1.30-1B2I. And it sets up a pretty big difference from what the tax benefit rule requires, because it applies no matter how many years have gone by before the inconsistent event occurs.
The regs are more generous than they need to be. You complaining?
Well, no, there's more. Not all dispositions are recapture events. The reg specifically says that the disposition of a vehicle, and I'm quoting here, including by reason of an accident or other casualty, is not a recapture event. That's in section 1.30-1B2II.
Oh, is that right? I haven't looked at that part of the reg. Let me take a look. I see what you're talking about. But you know, there's an exception to the exception. It reads, except as provided in paragraph B2IC. Now I'm paraphrasing. A disposition or sale is not a recapture event. That exception is pretty important. Dispositions are recapture events if the vehicle won't any longer be powered by electricity or used outside the country or by a governmental or tax-exempt entity. That tells me that the exception you're talking about is for a disposition followed by continued use of the vehicle as a primarily electric-powered vehicle by a taxable person. When ACE returned these vehicles to the manufacturer, they weren't going to stay in use, at least not unless somebody else came along and bought them and then took the credit later. So, as far as I can see, this exception doesn't apply to your case. ACE's disposition of the vehicles was inconsistent with ACE not being allowed to keep the benefit of the credit.
Hold on. It doesn't say that. It says dispositions are not recapture events unless the vehicle will be modified or used by an exempt person. We don't have that here. The vehicles won't be modified and they won't be used by a non-taxable user such as foreign resident or public charity.
I don't think you're right about this, but I'll think it over. What's the other argument you wanted to make?
If and I mean if, because we're not conceding the point that this is a proper case for the tax benefit rule or for recapture under Section 30, if anything should be added to ACE's tax liability for 2011, it shouldn't be the full $750,000.
Why not?
The credit reduced ACE's liability in 2009, but it didn't reduce it by the full amount of the credit. Now, ACE would have been entitled to a greater depreciation of the vehicles in 2009 and 2010 if it hadn't been able to use the credit, because the credit reduced ACE's liability for depreciation. And without the credit, it could have saved $178,500 in taxes by depreciating the vehicles for the first year. Now, so the amount added to ACE's tax liability for 2011, if anything, should be the difference between $750,000 and the $178,500, which is $571,500.
Not so fast. The service agrees with what you say about the credit changing the benefit of usual depreciation. But the difference is only the difference in tax savings between depreciation allowable with the credit and depreciation allowable without it. That's not the full $178,500 you mentioned. It's only $26,250, because ACE, with the credit, could still claim depreciation of $152,250. And it did claim that on its return, which we both have in front of us.
Well, I'd like to beef up our arguments and answer some of your points in them, if you don't mind. I'd like to submit a short memo and discuss what we've discussed here.
Okay, that could be very helpful. And I'll read whatever you submit very carefully. By the way, the service is going to want to claim that the tax benefit rule overrides the recapture provisions of the Section 30 regs. So I'd like to know what you have to say about that. You could also include something in your written submission about whether the fundamental inconsistency test in Hillsborough National Bank versus Commissioner applies, even if Section 30 doesn't require recapture.